What if everything you've been told about Mary Magdalene is wrong? What if she wasn't the sinner the church made her out to be? What if the woman who stood at the foot of Jesus' cross was actually someone much more powerful in his life than anyone ever realized? Stay with me, because we're about to uncover a side of Mary Magdalene that you won't find in the traditional scriptures. Before we dive into Mary Magdalene's true story, let's set the stage and understand the world she lived in. In the time of Jesus, women were often seen as second-class citizens, their roles restricted and their voices silenced. In a deeply patriarchal society, women had little to no say in religious matters, but Mary Magdalene's life would shatter that societal norm. Mary was from a small fishing town called Magdala on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. The name Magdalene was derived from her hometown, and like many women of her time, she likely had a modest and humble life. It's important to note that Mary was not a member of the upper class or even of the religious elite. She was not someone who could have commanded the respect of society by wealth or status. But something happened to Mary that would change her life forever. The Gospels tell us that Jesus cast 7 demons out of her, which some scholars interpret as a metaphor for personal suffering, illness, or even the effects of trauma. In a world where women like Mary were often marginalized and oppressed, she was transformed by the healing power of Jesus. This encounter marked the beginning of Mary Magdalene's deep connection to Jesus. This healing wasn't just a one-time event. It was a transformation that allowed her to become one of the most devoted followers of Jesus. She wasn't just a passive bystander in the crowd. She was a woman whose life had been radically altered by Jesus' teachings and miracles. She was among the women who followed him, learned from him, and became witnesses to his most profound moments. But there's more, much more to her story. In a time where most women were barely acknowledged in historical or religious texts, Mary Magdalene's name appears more than a dozen times in the New Testament, often in the company of Jesus' closest disciples. And yet, for centuries, her legacy has been distorted, reduced to a figure who was saved by Jesus, but whose deeper significance was overlooked. Now that we understand Mary Magdalene's background and the society in which she lived, let's dive deeper into the moments leading up to her pivotal role in Jesus' life. Mary was not just another follower in the crowd. She had witnessed the miracles, listened to the teachings, and felt the profound transformation in her own life. But what sets her apart from the other women who followed Jesus is her unwavering devotion. While many disciples struggled with fear or doubt, Mary stood firm. Her commitment to Jesus would be tested in ways no one could have foreseen. As the tension between Jesus and the authorities grew, Mary was right there by his side, watching as the man who had healed her began to challenge the very foundations of the religious establishment. The atmosphere in Jerusalem was charged with unrest, and it was clear that something monumental was about to unfold. But there was more. Mary's bond with Jesus was unique. The other disciples were often depicted as being in the background, questioning and sometimes faltering. But Mary Magdalene was present at some of Jesus' most crucial moments. She was not a passive observer. She was actively involved in Jesus' mission, his message, and his ultimate sacrifice. As Jesus' arrest grew imminent, the tension mounted. Mary Magdalene found herself at the center of it all, caught between the growing danger surrounding Jesus and her own love and devotion for him. It would be during these dark times that Mary's role would be solidified, and it was far greater than anyone could have anticipated. As the plot to arrest Jesus thickened, Mary's loyalty was never in question. On the night of the Last Supper, when most of the disciples were scattered or hiding in fear, Mary Magdalene remained steadfast. She had witnessed the love, teachings, and power of Jesus in ways that others couldn't fully grasp. As Jesus was betrayed by Judas and arrested, Mary's heart must have been heavy with fear and sorrow. But despite the peril, she stayed close to Jesus. She was present during his trial, watching as he was mocked and condemned. And when the moment came for Jesus to carry his cross to Golgotha, the hill where he would be crucified, Mary was one of the few who followed him, carrying her grief and disbelief. The tension in the air was palpable. Mary must have known that what was coming next was beyond anything she could have imagined. As Jesus was crucified, Mary Magdalene was there, watching him endure unimaginable pain and suffering. But in that moment, something extraordinary happened. Mary witnessed the true depth of Jesus' sacrifice. She was there when the darkness of the world seemed to have won. But the story doesn't end there. In the hours following Jesus' death, when hope seemed lost, Mary Magdalene's life would take an even more extraordinary turn, one that would completely alter the course of Christian history. After the unimaginable loss of Jesus' death, the world around Mary Magdalene seemed to crumble. The man who had healed her, taught her, and transformed her life was now gone. But despite the darkness, there was something deep within her that refused to let go of the truth. On the third day after Jesus' death, Mary Magdalene went to his tomb, alone, devastated, but determined to see him one last time. She didn't expect a miracle. She didn't expect resurrection. What she expected was to mourn, to grieve, and to pay her respects to the man who had forever changed her life. But when she arrived, she found the stone rolled away from the entrance and the tomb empty. Confused and frightened, she ran to tell the disciples, but when they arrived, they left in disbelief, thinking she had simply been mistaken. But Mary stayed. She lingered near the tomb, her heart racing with confusion, sorrow, and a flicker of hope she could barely comprehend. As she wept, something extraordinary happened. She saw someone standing before her. At first, she didn't recognize him, but then, through her tears, the voice spoke. It was Jesus. He was alive. This moment, the resurrection, was one of the most profound and earth-shattering events in history. But what makes it even more extraordinary is that it wasn't one of the disciples who witnessed it first. It wasn't Peter or John. It was Mary Magdalene, the woman who had followed Jesus from the beginning, the woman who had witnessed his crucifixion, the woman who had been healed by his touch. She was the first to see him alive. And in that moment, Mary Magdalene became not just a witness, but the first messenger of the resurrection. Jesus' resurrection was the cornerstone of the Christian faith, the event that would shape the future of the church. But it wasn't just a miraculous act, it was a statement. And the fact that Mary Magdalene was the first to see the risen Christ had profound implications. When Jesus appeared to Mary, he entrusted her with an extraordinary responsibility. He told her to go and tell the others what she had seen. In this moment, Mary Magdalene was not just a follower. She was the first person to proclaim the resurrection of Christ to the world. She became the apostle to the apostles, the one who carried the most significant news of all. And yet, despite this monumental role, her testimony was often dismissed. In the early church, women's voices were often silenced, but Mary's role was too important to ignore. She wasn't just the first witness of the resurrection. She was the one who understood its power. Her encounter with the risen Christ is a testament to the deep and transformative relationship she had with Jesus. It was Mary who recognized him first, and it was Mary who was entrusted with the message that would change everything. What's even more extraordinary is that Mary Magdalene's story wasn't just about being a witness. It was about being the first one to understand the true meaning of resurrection and what it meant for humanity. Her role in the history of Christianity cannot be overstated. After Mary Magdalene's incredible encounter with the risen Christ, the world she knew would never be the same. But while Mary understood the magnitude of what had just occurred, the reaction of others was far from what she might have expected. She was eager to share the extraordinary news, but the disciples, still grappling with shock, fear, and doubt, weren't immediately ready to believe her testimony. In fact, when Mary told them that she had seen Jesus alive, they didn't trust her words. They dismissed her as a woman who was either confused or hallucinating. It was a painful moment for Mary. She had witnessed the resurrection herself, yet her testimony was rejected by those closest to Jesus. Still, Mary's faith didn't waver. She had seen the truth with her own eyes, and nothing could shake that knowledge. The emotional toll on Mary was significant. She had experienced the devastating loss of Jesus' death, the terror of his crucifixion, and the overwhelming joy of his resurrection. She was carrying the weight of this divine revelation, yet no one was willing to listen. But Mary wasn't about to be silenced. She knew what she had seen, and she was determined to share it, whether the world believed her or not. Eventually, after much hesitation and disbelief, the disciples began to understand the truth of Mary's words. The resurrection of Jesus was not a lie. It was a reality that was too powerful to ignore. Jesus appeared to the disciples, confirming what Mary had already shared with them. But by then, something had shifted in the early Christian community. The role of women, and especially Mary Magdalene, began to be reconsidered. Mary's emotional journey was far from over. As the news of Jesus' resurrection spread, Mary's own role in that story became more apparent. She wasn't just a follower. She was the first to witness the resurrection and the first to spread the good news. But this recognition came at a price. Over time, the church, which was male-dominated, tried to minimize Mary's role. Her status as the apostle to the apostles was downplayed, and in many later texts, her significance was diminished. Despite this, Mary's faith and resilience never wavered. She continued to be a prominent figure in the early Christian community, even though history often overlooked her true role. The emotional toll of being both the first witness to Christ's resurrection and the first to face rejection from her peers would linger in Mary's life. But her commitment to the truth, to the love she had for Jesus, and to the mission he had entrusted her with remained unshaken. While Mary Magdalene's immediate role in the resurrection was clear, the long-term consequences of her actions were more complex. The early Christian church, which was largely shaped by male leaders, often struggled with the idea of women holding prominent roles within it. Despite her critical role in proclaiming the resurrection, Mary's status began to be overshadowed. Over time, the church's patriarchal structure diminished her influence, distorting her legacy and minimizing her true importance. One of the most significant impacts of this was the portrayal of Mary Magdalene as a sinner, a label that was never truly supported by the gospel accounts. Early Christian texts, including the writings of church fathers like Pope Gregory I, conflated Mary Magdalene with the woman who was a sinner in Luke 7. This misunderstanding of her character persisted for centuries, influencing how she was viewed by both the church and society. Her identity as a redeemed sinner became a central part of her narrative, but it obscured her true role as one of Jesus' closest and most devoted followers. This false narrative became entrenched in Christian thought, and as the centuries passed, Mary Magdalene's status as the apostle to the apostles was buried beneath layers of misconception. The suppression of her true role in the early church was part of a larger pattern of sidelining women's contributions to the faith. The suppression of Mary Magdalene's role didn't just affect her personal legacy, it had a ripple effect on how women were treated in the church for centuries. The church's portrayal of women as secondary to men, as followers rather than leaders, became a dominant theme that affected the development of Christian doctrine and practice. As a result, the idea of a woman as the first to witness the resurrection and the first to preach the good news was suppressed. But in recent years, historians and theologians have begun to reevaluate Mary Magdalene's legacy. Scholars have turned to the Gospel of Mary, a text that was excluded from the biblical canon, and found evidence that Mary Magdalene was not just a witness, but a teacher and leader in the early Christian movement.